So we're going to
All
talk
right.
about the aesthetic.
I feel like I'm going to talk about things that are only half relevant to it. Aesthetic is narrative. That's not actually the point, but there's another YouTuber who makes that point called Digibro. I'm going to connect those two. So the whole point is that gender isn't just this nothing. It isn't just like this idea in your head. It's not like you can't just think. You can't just have a desire and really be a gender or be anything. You have to put the rubber on the road. You have to, say in order to pass, for instance, you have to put the aesthetic there. You have to show yourself in the way that you want to be seen. So all the ideas about like society is oppressing you because they're informing these gender norms, that doesn't matter because this is how people interpret gender. So if you want to pass, then you're going to have to adopt the aesthetic. You're going to have to become womanly in the most stereotypical sense. Because being assigned male, so I guess this is all from the perspective of assigned male at birth trans women. There are other people with different experiences. If you're assigned male, then you have certain features about your face and your body that you can't change. So you have to work around them. You have to like super emphasize your feminine features and de-emphasize your masculine features to compensate, which would present the aesthetic. And that's really what matters, is the aesthetic. TLDR, aesthetic.
The issue here is that people have their expectations of what things are. And why do people come to their expectations of things? Do expectations mean anything? It's like, well, I think people's expectations of how things are do contain information about the real world. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't say that just because people's common sense of their expectations are reality or they reflect really how things truly are, but they do contain information about reality.
Well, so people act on their expectations. Their expectations form a part of an individual's reality. Anybody as an individual can't change everybody's expectations. You can't decide them. Really, they're just facts about the world that you have to deal with. It's really up to you. Are you going to deal with these expectations? Are you going to act based on them? Or are you going to pretend that they don't exist and then, hey, look, you get misgendered? I would say if you want to pass, if you value passing, then you're going to have to take into account the fact that people have certain expectations and are going to react in a certain way and use the tools that you have available so that they react the way that you want them to. Because it's a losing battle to say, you know what, society sucks and I'm going to go against society and then have a gender non-conforming appearance and then get misgendered all the time, unless you're okay with getting misgendered.
The clear response to this, these expectations exist. We'll engage in our mass education program. We'll attempt to properly educate people and destroy these expectations. These expectations are complete nonsense and they're just a bunch of brainwashing, or they represent some sort of false societal belief that informs these expectations, which we could actually correct. And what I'm actually saying, though, is that there are literally things which you cannot correct because they represent real, true statements that inform people's expectations are fundamentally informed by true things that exist. And to attempt to say, well, we just correct everybody's expectations or destroy the concept of the expectation is naive and nonsensical. And some people believe that the expectation, or a very strong majority of the expectations, or a broad class of expectations, are false and should be abolished.
I see that. I also have another way of addressing my own argument. I think this is something that they might say from their perspective. And it's the fact that some people have gender identities or preferences about like how they present, which are not going to conform to society's expectations. Some people are agender, some people are non-binary, and some people are gender non-conforming. And the fact is, from an individual perspective, that makes them the happiest to act in those ways. When you add in the fact that people react to that non-traditional appearance in a way that misgenders them or invalidates them, that's like a real harm to them. So like people are kind of stuck in a rut, because if they just conform to society's expectations, well, that's exactly what they were trying not to do. That's exactly what like got them in their depressed state in the first place. They can't really be happy by conforming to society's expectations. And they would be much happier. They wouldn't commit suicide as much, for instance, if society's expectations changed, so that they would not get misgendered and not be invalidated and be respected and that kind of thing. It's about individual freedom to be happy in your uniqueness. And society kind of tramples on that when they have certain expectations about how people should act and present themselves. Maybe that would be their argument for changing people's expectations. We shouldn't ask individuals to change themselves to society. We should ask society to be more flexible with individual presentation.
I very much agree with that argument. I've been reading Solinsky's Rules for Radicals.
Oh, yes.
I want to do a write-up on how we could actually apply that to libertarian organization, because fundamentally a lot of libertarians don't hold power. I mean, there's some powerful friends who support libertarianism, but we don't hold power in the grand scheme. So here's my point about the aesthetic. When we talk about Solinsky, he talks about the people you're building friends with, you need to work within their experience. Now sure, fuck your enemies. When you're building a coalition of your friends, you need to understand the experience of them. I think a lot of people, they miss out in attempting to engage with people on their own terms. You know, it's not always just struggle against the transphobe, it's also just the struggle against people who have their own perspective, present something within their realm of understanding. Because, you know, each person, you know, trans person has their own perspective. A conservative Christian who grew up in rural Pennsylvania that I can come across my campus, maybe hostile to trans people, they have their own particular perspective that they grew up, and they have their own set of experiences that inform their beliefs. Me understanding where they're coming from, I can construct and I can engage with them properly to tell them this is not about, are you compromising with a transphobe? It's like, no, most certainly not. I'm not validating any of the ideas of a transphobe. All that I'm setting forward is the idea that operate inside of their experiences and be very clear and direct, but understand how to explain it to them so that they can understand inside their experiences.
I agree pretty much with all of that.
Okay.
Operate within people's experience. Yeah, do that. It's a good pragmatic choice, and it doesn't mean compromising on your own ideas. Just try to state your own ideas in a way that they can understand.
This idea of like moderacy. No, you can be a radical. Trouble of the radical, which makes it very hard, is that you have to know how to best communicate. You have to know how to pull in the moderate and explain the radical ideas and build the coalition around your radical cause. You can incorporate a large base of moderates, and a lot of radical causes do draw their support from ultimately a large base of moderates. And I think fundamentally it would be helpful to communicate to very important conservative influencers transgender ideas. I mean, I think there's other reasons why a conservative would oppose, because it's not very popular. And if they want to be a popular conservative, if you're a conservative and you advocate for pro or trans positive ideas, conservative influencer who may possibly have to weigh over whether he's going to talk about transgender issues or not from a trans positive perspective would have to weigh on how his own audience is, and the effective ability of communicating his own conservative ideas. So the issue is that, okay, how do I explain this? The SJW, it's like, hey, are you very familiar with the wage gap? You know, bring up that argument. They're very skeptical of transgender people. It's like, well, first of all, you're their friend. Like, well, the wage gap, you know, are you very familiar with that? You know, I'm familiar with statistician Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, the originator of the modern wage gap argument that a lot of people use, the idea of discrimination of groups. It's not necessarily about, is a group really discriminated against? Like, well, if you consider each group, if you consider, well, people who have this grades and they come from these schools, you know, you start seeing the gap massively decrease. And this is the question is, well, is a group discriminated against, some sort of minority actually discriminated against, or is it just because they have failed to enter in various other membership of groups which would predispose them to poor outcomes? And is the real issue of why aren't they actually being represented in various other important groups, not necessarily when it comes to employment, because the employer could not be discriminating against them, would just be looking at the pure qualifications. The question is, why don't they have equal qualifications? And it kicks the argument away from the actual employers who are discriminating into maybe other questions, and that this idea of the wage gap in terms of the responsibility of the employer may be a false start. And this is a very popular conservative argument. And you start dropping names like Saul. You bring up the issue of the wage gap. You reform them. These are very comfortable things. They're very like, wow. Yes, you're on my side. You speak my language. These are things that they would expect to hear. So you do understand that when we talk about transgender suicide risk, when we're talking about people like that, we're talking about people who are massively part of groups like kicked out of their home when they are very young, fired, or lose friends, or lose housing opportunities, or experience violence, domestic violence, or violence from pure strangers. I mean, these are very negative outcomes which cause high rates of suicide and serious mental troubles. Like, sure, being transgender is a mental issue that people struggle with, but what you're talking about is things that are very external to the actual mental condition. We're talking about things like suicide rates and troubled mental health issues, that we're talking about people who, transgender people, are so radically a part of these groups that one thing that we need to definitely consider, though, is we need to be nicer to transgender people. We need to stand up. We need to fight against people who are violent or oppressive. You need to actually care. You need to be compassionate about the experiences and the trouble and the violence that is occurring to transgender people. And that's part of the reason why you're having these terrible mental health outcomes. And because, well, there's other causes. It's not necessarily that the transgender person is, the act of being transgender is causing mental issues. It's that being caused that we're not looking at. And if you address those issues, you're going to solve the actual problem. And people are like, okay, well, that's very good, but you're still not addressing the underlying issue of like, well, the act of being transgender, what they would call the choice of being transgender, is that causing additional problems? Like, well, people who are transgender, they have all these, negative things that are happening to them. And what I would tell these people is like, well, okay, let's look at something like that. You're very familiar with these Ben Shapiro, 40% of people who have, this transgender genital surgery. I'd written something about this, a very memey article on my blog, pointing out the fallacy, which I very clearly that, well, if the assertion is that the choice of being transgender causing, it's like, well, the act of transitioning, what has been demonstrated is that people who are, there's no actual really increase in frequency of total lifetime suicide before the genital surgery and after the genital surgery. So if we're being consistent here, if you actually want to talk about what is stopping suicides and is actually improving mental health outcomes, you'd have to support the idea of transition and have to, if you actually care about the mental health outcomes of transgender people, we know that, well, 43% of people who want genital surgery had a suicidal issue in their life, and about 43% of people who have gone through with genital surgery have had a suicidal issue in their life. So if your hypothesis was that the choice is causing suicide, then wouldn't we expect an increase between the prior group that has yet to go through the action and the people who have gone through with the action? It's like, no, there is no increase. And that fundamentally what this shows us is that actually the choice is what is solving. It is actually a solution to the mental health struggles. You're saving lives here by the treatment. And like I said, it's an effective treatment. Is that, well, if you have such a high risk suicide group transitioning into a group of extremely low risk suicide, it's like, well, you solve the issue. And if you're being a compassionate person, you would have to support that. And that's all I have to say to that person. Is I've talked to people and communicating to people the issues. And I think, you have to speak their language. You have to bring up some comfort to them, but also you have to be firm in what you're preaching. The issue is, what is the best action? Like, sure, being transgender is not pleasant, but we're trying to make the best outcomes, trying to make the best choices, and we have to use the available information to make those best choices. That's all I have to say on the issue. Well,
Damn, I feel like I just agree with most of the things you said.
You gotta force your ideological opponents to be consistent. So regardless if you personally believe with anything I have actually just said in the parallels I have drawn, things like the wage gap, for example, regardless if you actually believe that, doesn't matter, because if you agree with Thomas Sowell or not, it doesn't matter. It matters that you hold your opponent to their beliefs. You further your own argument, you further your own cause, and that's what actually matters. In this case, if you care about promoting good, positive opinions and people to actually be advocates or at least somewhat supporters of transgender rights.
By good, positive ideas, we of course mean libertarian ideas.
Well, in this case, I don't even really care about libertarian ideas. I'm just talking about changing individuals' opinions of how you should treat transgender people.
Yeah, and in my little clique, we would call that statement a joke.
I mean, fundamentally, I don't really care about all these ideas like state action or whatever, because I'm just like, well, the bigger issue for me is like, well, individuals making their own choices, regardless if the state is involved or not in oppressing transgender people, there's still the issue of individuals and their own choices.
And how individuals treat transgender people and contribute to...
And I still would consider myself a support, regardless of whatever the laws are. The laws aren't actually the issue. I don't really care. I'm not a status of like, well, once the laws are all changed, that's not a moral victory for me. I don't really care about the law. I mean, sure, I wouldn't want laws exist to oppress anybody, but the actual larger issue is not abusing other people or not being terrible to other people. And sure, I don't think you should force people. You can have your own opinion.
Be mean. Never be mean.
I'd never be mean. Just don't be cruel to people. Try to positively associate with many conservative people for various reasons, but there's a lot of hostility to transgender people. It's very hard to communicate these ideas to people. So, but my point is that you should still attempt to do it the best you can. And here's the thing: I'm going to say this is that this times where I've been like really pissed off, and I got very angry, and I feel like the reaction has been like, well, this is just a crazy transgender person, and that's fine, whatever. I'm not operating from a privileged position, but you have to struggle, and that's the thing, that not everybody is operating from a privileged position. You can't wish upon that you have privilege, or you can't whine, or you can't moan about that. You're just gonna have to put in the work, and it's hard, and fuck, if you live in a place where you lack privilege, like your options are either fight it, put in the hard work, and it might be fucking painful, move somewhere else, which a lot of people want to move if they can, but sometimes you got to put in the work. I don't feel like I'm being threatened to be beaten up on many occasions. There's a few where I'm not getting beaten up for being transgender like many people. Threatened by police action or state action, or I have a lot better than a lot of other people. Okay. So,
especially living in Seattle, I've actually pretty much never had a negative experience with somebody while I was out and about. Everybody's either ignored me, or if I actually knew them, sort of talked to them, they were just very, very supportive and kind. I feel like that's just I'm just lucky there.